Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. Which AWS service can be used in conjunction with AWS fault injection service for monitoring and alerting during fault injection tests? AWS Shield, AWS X-Ray, AWS Inspector, AWS CloudWatch. AWS CloudWatch can be used alongside AWS Fault Injection Service to monitor resources and set up alerts during fault injection tests, helping track performance and resilience metrics. What is a limitation of AWS Fault Injection Service in relation to fault injection into AWS Lambda functions? It requires custom IAM policies for Lambda functions. It cannot simulate cold starts of Lambda functions. It does not support injecting faults into AWS Lambda functions directly. It does not integrate with AWS X-Ray for Lambda monitoring. A limitation of AWS Fault Injection Service is that it does not support injecting faults directly into AWS Lambda functions. What is a primary use case for AWS Fault Injection Service? Increasing server uptime. Monitoring real-time application performance. Automating security patch installations. Testing application resilience to failures. AWS Fault Injection Service is primarily used for testing and improving application resilience by simulating various failure scenarios in controlled environments. How can AWS Fault Injection Service contribute to improving application performance? By enhancing data encryption protocols. By automating application deployment processes. By identifying and eliminating network bottlenecks through fault injection tests. By reducing server downtime during maintenance windows. AWS Fault Injection Service can contribute to improving application performance by identifying and eliminating network bottlenecks through fault injection tests. What is the primary purpose of AWS Fault Injection Service? To monitor network traffic for anomalies. To help customers build resilience against failures by injecting faults into their applications and infrastructure. To automate database schema changes. To provide real-time analysis of application performance. AWS Fault Injection Service is designed to inject faults into AWS resources to help customers simulate real-world failures and build resilience. What is a key advantage of using AWS Fault Injection Service for fault injection testing? It allows for precise and targeted fault injection across AWS resources. It does not require AWS credentials to operate. It integrates seamlessly with all AWS services. It requires minimal setup and configuration. A key advantage of using AWS Fault Injection Service is its capability to allow precise and targeted fault injection across various AWS resources, aiding in testing and improving fault tolerance. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate network congestion? AWS Direct Connect, Amazon CloudFront, Amazon S3 Transfer Acceleration, AWS Snowball. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with AWS Direct Connect to simulate network congestion and test application behavior under slow network conditions. What is a key advantage of using AWS Fault Injection Service over traditional testing methods? It provides faster test results. It automatically rolls back changes post-testing. It enables testing in production-like environments without causing actual disruptions. It requires less manual configuration. AWS Fault Injection Service allows testing in production-like environments by injecting controlled faults without causing actual disruptions, which is advantageous over traditional methods. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what is the purpose of the duration setting in fault injection experiments? To set the number of fault injection attempts per resource. To specify how long faults are injected into resources. To define the AWS region where faults will be injected. To schedule the start time of fault injections. The duration setting in AWS Fault Injection Service specifies how long faults are injected into resources during fault injection experiments. What is a key advantage of integrating AWS Fault Injection Service with AWS step functions? Reducing CloudFront latency. Enhancing database security. Optimizing network routing. Automating fault injection tests in serverless workflows. A key advantage of integrating AWS Fault Injection Service with AWS step functions is automating fault injection tests within serverless workflows, ensuring consistent and controlled testing. In which AWS region is AWS Fault Injection Service available? US East. Asia Pacific. Multiple AWS regions. Check AWS documentation for current availability. Europe. AWS Fault Injection Service is available in multiple AWS regions, but availability can vary. Checking AWS documentation is recommended. Which of the following is a benefit of using AWS Fault Injection Service? Improved resilience through controlled fault injection. Enhanced data transfer speeds. Reduced cost of AWS services. Increased scalability without downtime. AWS Fault Injection Service improves resilience by allowing controlled fault injection, helping identify weaknesses in architectures without affecting production. Which AWS service integrates directly with AWS Fault Injection Service for injecting faults into EC2 instances? AWS Systems Manager. Amazon RDS. AWS Lambda. Amazon S3. AWS Fault Injection Service integrates directly with AWS Systems Manager to inject faults into EC2 instances, allowing controlled testing of fault tolerance mechanisms. Which AWS resource type does AWS Fault Injection Service primarily target for fault injection tests? Compute instances. Content delivery networks. Streaming data services. Blockchain networks. AWS Fault Injection Service primarily targets compute instances for fault injection tests, allowing controlled testing of application and infrastructure resilience. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate DNS resolution failures? AWS Key Management Service. Amazon Route 53. AWS Database Migration Service. AWS Secrets Manager. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with Amazon Route 53 to simulate DNS resolution failures and test application resilience to DNS-related issues. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what is the purpose of the Stop After First Failure setting? To automatically restart any failed instances. To pause the experiment temporarily for manual review. To continue fault injection until the recovery window ends. To halt the fault injection experiment upon the first detected issue. The Stop After First Failure setting in AWS Fault Injection Service halts the fault injection experiment upon the first detected issue, allowing immediate analysis of the impact. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what does the recovery window setting determine? The speed at which faults are injected. The duration after fault injection to observe system recovery. The number of recovery attempts allowed before system failure. The frequency of fault injection tests. The recovery window in AWS fault injection service determines the duration after fault injection during which system recovery and behavior are observed. What is a potential benefit of using AWS fault injection service to test fault tolerance mechanisms? Identifying and resolving application vulnerabilities before deployment. Enhancing application load balancing. Improving DNS resolution times. Increasing data backup frequency. A potential benefit of using AWS fault injection service to test fault tolerance mechanisms is identifying and resolving application vulnerabilities before deployment. Which AWS service feature can AWS fault injection service help test and validate? Database schema changes. Auto-scaling policies. Lambda function execution times. Data transfer speeds. AWS fault injection service can help test and validate auto-scaling policies by injecting faults to observe scaling behavior under different conditions. What is a key consideration when selecting the fault injection rate setting in AWS fault injection service? To ensure tests remain within acceptable performance thresholds. To maximize CloudWatch alarms triggered. To minimize fault injection latency. To inject faults across all resources simultaneously. When selecting the fault injection rate in AWS fault injection service, it's crucial to ensure tests remain within acceptable performance thresholds to avoid excessive disruption. In AWS fault injection service, what does safety checks help ensure during fault injection experiments? That the AWS region selected is compatible with fault injection. That all CloudWatch alarms are disabled during testing. That the fault injection experiments complete within a specified time frame. That injected faults do not cause irreversible damage or data loss. Safety checks in AWS fault injection service help ensure that injected faults do not cause irreversible damage or data loss during fault injection experiments. Which AWS service can AWS fault injection service integrate with to simulate service disruptions in a controlled manner? AWS Code Pipeline. AWS Elastic Load Balancing. Amazon S3. AWS Direct Connect. AWS Fault Injection Service integrates with AWS Elastic Load Balancing to simulate service disruptions and test load balancing configurations. How can AWS Fault Injection Service help improve disaster recovery strategies? By identifying weaknesses in recovery procedures through controlled tests. By enhancing DNS resolution. By automating daily backups. By reducing data transfer times. AWS Fault Injection Service helps improve disaster recovery strategies by identifying weaknesses in recovery procedures through controlled fault injection tests. What is a recommended step before starting a fault injection test with AWS Fault Injection Service? Backup critical data and configurations. Run a load test on production servers. Disable all network security rules. Increase the number of active instances. Before starting a fault injection test with AWS Fault Injection Service, it's recommended to back up critical data and configurations to mitigate potential risks. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate failure of backend databases? AWS Amplify. Amazon RDS. AWS WAF. Amazon Pinpoint. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with Amazon RDS to simulate failure of backend databases and test failover mechanisms. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.